Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. This is by Chris Vela. Pictures are by James Bernardin. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Christmas time was full of joy and happiness, usually. But one year, long ago, Christmas wasn't very happy at all. Times were hard in New York City, and the weather was especially cold. People hurried through the streets, bundled up against the chill. No one stopped to smile or say, "Hello, Christmas was just a few weeks away." But nobody seemed to notice. Nobody except a little girl named Virginia. Virginia loved Christmas. She loved the glittering lights. She loved the joyful carols. But most of all, she loved Santa Claus. She could hardly wait for Christmas Eve when she would set out a plate of cookies and listen for jingle bells. This year, she even made her very own Santa book. "Wow," Virginia's best friend Ollie explained as he looked at the book. "We should show this to Tom and Taylor and George. Come on, let's go." Virginia was a bit nervous about showing it to everybody, but Ollie was already running down the stairs, so Virginia grabbed the book and followed him out the door. At the park, the older children gathered around to see Virginia's book. Everybody was so excited, they all shouted at once. "Last year, Santa brought me a train set," said Tom. "He brought me a dollhouse," exclaimed Taylor. "I got a baseball mitt," said George. "Did Santa bring you a baby's bottle?" said a voice. Charlotte, the meanest, bossiest, snootiest girl in town, pushed her friend forward. "You still believe in Santa Claus?" Charlotte scoffed. "Ha, that's hysterical. No one could travel the whole world in one night." "That's not true," said Virginia. "Santa is real, as you are." "It's baby stuff," teased Charlotte. She grabs Virginia's Santa book with a laugh and held it high above her head. "Give it back," said Virginia. "Stop it," said Ollie, rushing to help. But Ollie tripped and bumped into Virginia, who crashed into Charlotte, who lost her grip on the book, which landed in the mud with a splat. Charlotte laughed. "Face it, Virginia," she sneered. "There is no Santa Claus." Virginia crawled cradled the wet, muddy book in her hands, and she knew in her heart that Charlotte was wrong. "There is a Santa Claus," she thought to herself, "and I'm going to go prove it." Well, there she is at the library. That afternoon, Virginia visited a place she knew was full of answers, the New York Public Library. "Let's see Santa Claus," said the friendly librarian. She pulled book after book after book from the shelves. "Ah, in England his name is Father Christmas. In Holland he's called Snickerlaas," read Virginia. "In Italy, Babbo Natal," Ollie cried. "According to this," the librarian flipping through the heavy book, "he lives in Finland, no wait, Greenland. And he has a giant coke," Ollie shouted. Virginia looked at the piles of books on the table. She was frustrated. This was all interesting, but none of it tells me if Santa is real. That evening, Virginia passed through Herald Square in the heart of the city. A man with a beard and a red cap stood on the street corner. Virginia's heart leaped, but the man was skinny and scraggly, and his beard was tied on with a string. "You're not Santa Claus," said Virginia. "That's true, I'm not," replied the man. "Then why are you dressed like him?" Virginia asked. "I suppose you say I work for him," said the scraggly Santa. "I try to do whatever Santa would do if he were here." The man jingled his rusty old bell. He was collecting money for the poor. Shouldn't you be wearing a coat? Asked Virginia. Well, I had one, but somebody else needed it more than me. More than I did. That night, Virginia asked her father, is there really a Santa Claus? He began. Well, somebody bought you presents last year, and somebody ate the milk and cookies you left. So logically, but Virginia was not listening to her father's long winded explanation. She was looking at something on her father's desk, a copy of the New York Sun. That's it, Virginia cried. I could write to the newspaper. Well, yes, I suppose you could, her father. After all, if you see it in the Sun, it is so. So Virginia went straight to her desk, took a pencil and paper, and she began to write a letter. Dear editor, she wrote, some of my friends say there is no Santa Claus. Virginia smiled. She knew that when the Sun received her letter, the editor would surely give her the answer she needed. A few days later, Virginia's letter arrived at the newspaper's office. Santa Claus, growled Frank Church, the editor of the Sun, preposterous. We report facts, not fantasies. I don't know, sir. Lewis, Mr. Church's assistant, maybe you should answer it. Lewis, people rely on the Sun for the truth, said Mr. Church. We need to maintain our credibility. But she's only a child, Lewis pleaded. Everybody grows up sometimes at church, said Coley, and he tossed Virginia's letter down in the garbage chute. With the chute went a loud clang. Meanwhile, Virginia sat in her own and moped. She was waiting and waiting, but she hadn't heard back from the newspaper. I just need some proof, Virginia sighed. Virginia, her mother said, believing in Santa Claus isn't something you prove, it's something you do. Whether we act like Santa would and are kind to others, that proves that he's real. Virginia thought about that, and then she remembered someone else who acted like Santa. Suddenly she had an idea. The next day, Virginia brought Shaggy Santa a Christmas present. A new coat, he exclaimed. Just what I needed. Thank you, Virginia said. Virginia, well, Virginia, he replied, today you're Santa Claus. Even though the Shaggy Santa was the one wearing the coat, Virginia felt warm inside. Isn't that adorable? A familiar face turned to see Charlotte standing nearby with her face with a nasty smile in her hand with a crumpled letter. I found this outside the newspaper office, Charlotte said, in a garbage can. Virginia felt a hole in the pit of her stomach. The newspaper had thrown out her letter anyway. She couldn't believe it. With tears in her eyes, she ran as fast as she could. That night, straggly Santa burst into Mr. Church's office. That letter was written by a friend of mine, said the scraggly Santa. I think you'd better answer it. I'm sorry, but I only print facts, replied Church gruffly. When people believe, they make the world a better place, he said. Answer that letter, and you'll give this girl and maybe the whole city something to believe in. Well, that night, Mr. Church didn't go home. Long after everybody else was asleep, he sat in his office thinking about what the scraggly Santa had said. If you see it in the sun, he mumbled himself, it's so. Virginia wasn't sleeping well either. She felt everything she loved, presents, Christmas, Santa Claus, just didn't matter anymore. Baby stuff, she sniffed sadly. Well, the next morning at breakfast, Virginia stared at her porridge. She didn't feel like eating. Her parents were worried. They had never seen their daughter so upset. Then there was a knock on the door. Hey, there it is. Is there a Santa Claus? Look, shouted Ollie as he held up a newspaper. Virginia gasped as she read the headlines. She couldn't believe her eyes. In the paper was an editorial message written just for her. Virginia, your little friends are wrong. They do not believe except for what they see. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. He exists as certainly as love and generosity and devotion exist. How dreary would this world be if there was no Santa Claus? It would be as dreary as if there were no Virginias. There would be no childlike faith, then no poetry, no romance. The eternal light with childhood filled the world would be extinguished. No Santa Claus? Thank God he lives. He lives forever. 1,000 years from now, Virginia, nay, 10,000. 10 times 10,000 years from now. He will continue to make glad the heart of childhood. Virginia was never had been so happy. There was a magical feeling inside her bursting to get out. Merry Christmas, she shouted to the streets below. Merry Christmas, replied an old man who was passing by. He had rosy cheeks, a snowy white beard, and a twinkle in his eye. The old man reached into his coat and handed something to Virginia. It was her Santa Claus book, good as new, with the tip of his hat. He continued on his way. Virginia smiled as she watched him go. And as she stood on the step, book in hand, Virginia thought the whole world seemed to glow a bit brighter. And see, there is a copy of the Sun article. Thank you